There is a photograph tucked behind the register at my family's restaurant that customers have asked about for 30 years. And for most of that time I told them it was just an old picture of my grandmother as a young woman, standing outside the building before it had a name. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I didn't know the whole truth myself until 11 years into my marriage, and when I finally learned it, I understood that the man I had married for money had actually been paying off a debt that had nothing to do with our marriage contract at all. A debt that started in that photograph, decades before either of us was born. I never asked him about it directly, not for 6 more months after I found out. That's the boundary I never crossed. I knew, and I said nothing, and I watched him instead, trying to understand a man I thought I'd already finished learning. I should tell you who I am first, because the order matters, and I've never laid this whole story out from the beginning before, not even to my own sister. My name is Camille Auberts. I'm 41, I live in New Orleans, in the Bywater, 3 blocks from the restaurant my grandmother opened in 1962 and that I now run myself, and I married a man named Sebastian Thorne 14 years ago for reasons that had almost nothing to do with love and almost everything to do with a balloon payment on a commercial loan that was going to take our restaurant out from under us within the year. My grandmother died when I was 19, before I was old enough to think to ask her the kinds of questions I wish now I'd asked. Who exactly had helped her get the restaurant off the ground, what the neighborhood had actually been like in those first lean years, why she kept that particular photograph behind the register instead of any of the dozens of others from that period. She wasn't a woman who talked much about the hard years. She talked about recipes, about regulars long since past, about the exact way my father used to steal biscuits off the cooling rack as a boy. Whatever debts and kindnesses had shaped the restaurant's survival in its earliest days, she carried most of that history quietly, and she carried it, I would learn much later, more literally than I ever imagined. I should start with how it began, because the order matters more than anything else in this story. My grandmother, Odette Auberts, built that restaurant out of almost nothing, in a neighborhood that wasn't fashionable then the way it's become since. And she ran it with a kind of stubbornness that kept it alive through 2 hurricanes, a recession, and more bad landlords than I can count. By the time it passed to my father, and then to me, after his heart gave out too early, the building itself had become the problem, a balloon payment structured decades earlier by a bank that no longer existed, sold and resold to increasingly impatient lenders, until the final holder of that note called it due in full, with 60 days' notice, the spring I turned 27. I remember the exact afternoon I understood how close we actually were to losing everything. It was a Friday, the lunch rush just finishing, and our accountant, a patient man named Foster who'd handled our books since my father's time, sat with me in the back office and laid the numbers out with a gentleness that somehow made them worse, not better. 60 days. A balloon payment north of $400,000, structured by a bank that had been bought and sold twice since the note originated, now held by an investment group in Houston that had no particular sentiment about a family restaurant in the Bywater. I remember going back out onto the floor afterward and finishing the lunch service on autopilot, smiling at regulars, refilling coffee, doing the entire performance of an ordinary day while some part of my mind sat frozen on the number 400,000. I had already exhausted every ordinary option by the time anyone mentioned the Thorne family. Sebastian's father, Julian Thorne, no relation to anyone in the stories you may have heard elsewhere, just a coincidence of a common enough name, ran an import and shipping business out of the port that had, decades earlier, financed a great many small businesses along the river when the traditional banks wouldn't. It was old Charles Thorne, Sebastian's grandfather, who had actually done that lending, back in the 60s, and it was Charles Thorne who appeared, unannounced and uninvited, in that photograph behind my register, a young man in a linen suit, standing beside my grandmother outside a restaurant that didn't have its sign up yet. I didn't know any of that when Sebastian's mother, Adeline Thorne, came to see me about the loan. She was polished in a way that made our worn dining room feel smaller than it was, and she laid out the arrangement plainly, the way you'd lay out terms for any transaction. The family would purchase the note outright and restructure it on generous terms, effectively saving the restaurant, in exchange for a marriage to her son, structured, she said, as a partnership of convenience, with clearly defined boundaries, separate lives beneath one shared roof for appearances, a renewable 1-year term either of us could decline to continue, and no scandal attached to either name if it ended. I remember sitting across from her, 27 years old, doing the arithmetic of my grandmother's whole life's work against the shape of my own future, and understanding that I was going to say yes before I'd even fully finished hearing the terms. I asked Adeline Thorne, in that first meeting, why marriage, specifically, when a straightforward loan restructuring would have accomplished the same financial outcome without dragging either of our lives into it. She considered the question for a moment longer than I expected before answering. There are reasons within the family for how this particular arrangement came to be proposed. I'll let my son explain them, if he ever chooses to. I assumed, at the time, that she meant something about business optics, about the Thorne name benefiting from a visible act of local goodwill. I understand now that she was choosing her words with far more precision than I gave her credit for. I want to establish plainly, and early, exactly what kind of arrangement this was, because it's the axis this whole story turns on. Sebastian and I were strangers when we married, in a courthouse ceremony that lasted 11 minutes, bound by a contract his family had drafted and mine had desperately agreed to. There was no courtship. There was, at the start, barely any conversation at all. He was 34 then, precise and reserved in a way people in the shipping business often are, a man who ran numbers in his head faster than most people could run them on paper, and who treated our early months together with a careful, almost formal distance, as if he understood exactly how easily the arrangement could curdle into something neither of us had agreed to, and was determined not to let that happen. I should tell you about 2 or 3 small things from those early years that will matter later. The first is that photograph behind the register, which Sebastian noticed on one of his first visits to the restaurant and stood looking at for a long moment, longer than seemed necessary for an old picture of a stranger's grandmother, before saying only, "She looks like she knew exactly what she was building," and changing the subject. The second is a habit he developed, maybe 8 months into the marriage, of arriving at the restaurant every Thursday evening around closing, always alone, always sitting at the same corner table, ostensibly to review shipping manifests, though I noticed, over time, that he rarely seemed to actually be reading them. The third is a particular phrase his mother used once, at a family dinner, when she thought I was still in the kitchen. He chose this one, "You know, nobody made him," which I filed away without understanding. The way you file away a comment that doesn't fit the story you think you're living inside. There's a particular Thursday from our second year I want to describe in full, because it's the clearest single scene I have of the tension building between us before either of us would have admitted to it. A pipe had burst in the kitchen after close, and I was on my knees mopping water away from the walk-in when Sebastian arrived for his usual visit, still in his work clothes, and without a word he simply rolled up his sleeves and started hauling the ruined boxes of dry goods out to the alley alongside me, not saying much, just working, until it was done well past midnight. Afterward we sat on the back steps, both of us soaked and exhausted, and he said, looking out at the alley instead of at me, "I don't actually know very much about running a restaurant." And I said, "You just spent 2 hours proving otherwise." And he almost smiled, and didn't say anything else, and I remember sitting there in the humid dark thinking that I had never, in my life, felt so plainly grateful for another person's presence without being able to say so. The tension between us built the way it does in a marriage neither person is willing to name, slowly, in scenes too small to describe to anyone without sounding foolish. It was in the fact that after a year, he'd started remembering which suppliers were giving me trouble and quietly asking about them the following week, without ever offering to intervene directly. It was in a look he held a beat too long once, across that corner table, before catching himself and going back to his manifests. It was in the fact that our Thursday closing routine slowly became something I looked forward to more than I let myself admit, even to myself, even on nights I told myself I was simply staying late to finish the books. My sous chef, Delphine, who had worked beside my grandmother for the last decade of her life and had no patience for pretense, asked me outright one night, scraping down the flat top after close, whether I was in love with my own husband. I told her it was a business arrangement. She looked at me the way you look at someone you're too fond of to argue with, and said only, and kept scraping. I had my own private theories, over those years, about what any of it meant, whether the Thursday visits were simply a careful man's way of checking on an investment, or whether there was something underneath them neither of us had the standing, under our own agreement, to say out loud. I never arrived at a certain answer, and I still haven't, fully, even now. There were nights I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading meaning into ordinary loyalty the way people do when they're lonelier than they'll admit. And there were other nights, usually right after he'd left, corner table empty, manifests still sitting there half-read, when I was almost certain something real had been sitting across from me all evening, and that neither of us had the right, under the terms we'd signed, to name it. The obstacle, when it finally became plain, wasn't cruel, and it wasn't a villain's obstacle, it was simply the honest shape of the family Sebastian had been raised inside. He told me, in our 3rd year, sitting at that same corner table, that his father had drilled into him from childhood a specific, unbending rule, that the Thorne family's business relationships and its personal ones were never, under any circumstances, to be allowed to blur into each other, because his grandfather Charles had once nearly lost the whole company in the 50s over exactly that kind of entanglement, a business partner turned brother-in-law whose divorce had torn apart a decade of shipping contracts along with the marriage. My father made me recite it like scripture, Sebastian said. Business is business, and family is family, and the day you let them trade places is the day you lose both. He told me this, I think, as much to explain his own careful distance from me as to explain anything about his father, and I understood, sitting there, that he had built his entire adult life around a rule designed to protect him from exactly the kind of feeling he seemed, more and more, to be fighting every Thursday at that table. He told me more about his grandfather that same evening at the corner table than he'd told me in the 2 years before it, how Charles Thorne had grown up with almost nothing on the docks himself, how the rule against blending business and family had come specifically from watching his own father, Sebastian's great-grandfather, lose a fishing boat and a marriage in the same ugly year over a bad partnership. It's not that my father thought feeling things was weak, Sebastian said, turning his coffee cup slowly without drinking from it. He thought it was dangerous when you let it decide who you did business with, or who you married. He used to say a man who confuses the two eventually loses his judgment about both. I asked him whether he believed that. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, I used to. I'm less sure lately, and didn't elaborate further, and I didn't push him to, understanding, even then, that some sentences need room to sit unfinished rather than being forced toward a conclusion neither of us was ready for. There was one evening, in our 4th year, when that boundary was tested plainly, and neither of us crossed it. We'd stayed later than usual, the whole staff gone, just the 2 of us and the hum of the walk-in cooler, and at some point he reached across the table to move a manifest out of the way and his hand brushed mine, and neither of us pulled back right away. We just sat there, for what felt like a very long moment, looking at each other in the kind of silence that has weight to it. Then he said, quietly, this is the part where I'm supposed to say something sensible about the rule my father drilled into me, and I said, then say it, and he said, I don't want to, and we both laughed, a little sadly, and then he did pull his hand back, and gathered his manifests, and told me he'd see me next Thursday, and neither of us ever spoke of that particular evening again, though I thought about it more than I can tell you over the years that followed. The 6th and 7th years brought a change none of us had planned for. Sebastian's father died suddenly of a stroke, and the running of the entire Thorne shipping operation fell to Sebastian far earlier than anyone had expected, which meant travel, long stretches in Houston and overseas, negotiating contracts his father had always handled personally. Our Thursday evenings became rare, then rarer still, sometimes months apart. I told myself, during that stretch, that whatever I felt for him by then, and by then I could no longer pretend to myself it was simple fondness, didn't matter, because the arrangement had never promised either of us more than what we'd agreed to at the start, and I wasn't going to be the one to ask for something he hadn't offered freely. I want to describe one more scene from those years apart, because it's the one that, looking back, told me the most, even though I didn't understand it fully at the time. Sebastian had called late one night from Houston, ostensibly about a supplier issue at the restaurant that genuinely didn't require his involvement at all, and we ended up talking for nearly an hour about nothing in particular. A documentary he'd watched on the flight, a dish I was testing for the spring menu, my sister's youngest starting kindergarten. Near the end of the call, there was a pause, and he said, quieter than the rest of the conversation, "I don't call Foster about supplier issues. I called because it was Thursday and I wasn't there." I didn't know what to say to that, so I told him about the biscuit recipe I was working on instead, and he let me change the subject, the way we always let each other change the subject, right up to the edge of the thing neither of us was ready to say. The discovery happened in year 11, on an afternoon I wasn't looking for anything at all. I was simply going through a box of my grandmother's old restaurant records for a newspaper feature on the building's history, and I found, tucked inside a ledger from 1971, a folded letter in handwriting I recognized instantly as Charles Thorne's, the man from the photograph behind my register. It was addressed to my grandmother, and in it, he thanked her for something the letter didn't fully explain. Apparently she had, decades earlier, quietly loaned him kitchen space and covered payroll for 2 of his dock workers during a strike that had nearly bankrupted his young shipping company, at a time when almost no one in the neighborhood would extend him any credit at all, because he was, in the letter's own careful words, not yet the kind of man anyone trusted with anything. He wrote that he intended to repay the debt not to her, since she'll refuse it, but to whoever in her family might need it someday, whenever that day comes, in whatever form it takes. I sat on the floor of that storage room for a long time, understanding, with a strange, slow-dawning clarity, exactly what I was looking at. I sat on the floor of that storage room for a long time, understanding, with a strange, slow-dawning clarity, exactly what I was looking at. There was a second page tucked behind the letter, too, in different handwriting, a short accounting in my grandmother's own hand, dates, small sums, a note reading simply CT, dock workers, 4 weeks, paid in full, no interest, never spoke of it again. She hadn't just loaned him space and covered his payroll. She'd apparently done it more than once, quietly, over the better part of a year, at a time when her own restaurant was barely staying afloat itself, and had never once, in nearly 6 decades afterward, mentioned any of it to a single member of our family. I called Sebastian's mother that same week, carefully, and asked her, without explaining why, whether Charles had ever spoken about an old debt to a restaurant family. She went quiet on the phone for a moment before she said, "So you found it? I always wondered if you would." She told me the rest of it plainly, that Charles had told the story to Sebastian's father, who'd told it to Sebastian as a boy, as a kind of family legend about honoring quiet debts, and that when the note on our restaurant came up for sale, years later, it was Sebastian, not his mother, not the business's lending committee, who had recognized the Aubaird's name and specifically requested the family purchase it before it could be sold to someone who'd simply foreclose. He didn't propose the marriage because of the debt, Adeline told me. That part, I think, surprised even him. But the debt is why he made sure it was your family's note that landed on his desk in the first place. I didn't tell him what I'd found, not that week, not for 6 months, the way I told you at the start. I wanted to understand it myself first, to sit with the specific vertigo of realizing that the beginning of my marriage, which I had always understood as pure transaction, had actually been set in motion decades before I was born, by a kindness my grandmother had extended to a struggling stranger and never once mentioned to any of us. I didn't tell him what I'd found, not that week, not for 6 months, the way I told you at the start. I wanted to understand it myself first, to sit with the specific vertigo of realizing that the beginning of my marriage, which I had always understood as pure transaction, had actually been set in motion decades before I was born, by a kindness my grandmother had extended to a struggling stranger and never once mentioned to any of us. I went back through her old ledgers more carefully after that, looking for anything else she might have kept quiet, and found, tucked in a box I'd never fully sorted, a stack of letters from customers over the decades thanking her for things I'd never heard about, a meal covered during a bad month, a job given to someone nobody else would hire, small kindnesses extended and apparently never spoken of again. My grandmother, I was slowly understanding, had built an entire second ledger alongside the restaurant's official books, one made entirely of debts she never intended to collect on, and Charles Thorne's letter was simply the one that had, decades later, found its way back around to me. Those 6 months were strange in a way I still find hard to fully describe. I watched Sebastian differently, noticing things I'd apparently trained myself not to notice consciously before, the way he still, 11 years in, remembered which of our suppliers had given me trouble years earlier and asked, gently, whether they'd ever come around, the way he'd quietly arranged, without ever mentioning it, for the restaurant's flood insurance to be upgraded the year after that burst pipe, at his own expense rather than the business's. I'd assumed, at the time, that had simply been an oversight on our part getting corrected. It hadn't been an oversight. None of it, I was slowly beginning to understand, had ever been an oversight. The direct conversation finally happened at that same corner table, on a slow Thursday evening almost identical to 100 others we'd shared there over 14 years. I told him what I'd found in the ledger. I watched something shift in his face, not surprise, exactly, more like the specific discomfort of a private inheritance being seen by someone he hadn't expected to ever show it to. I've known that story since I was maybe 9 years old, he said. My grandfather used to tell it like a bedtime story. I didn't go looking for your family's note because I was trying to arrange a marriage, Camille. I went looking for it because it felt like the kind of thing you don't leave to chance, once you know where it came from. He never said the word love. I never said it either. But sitting there, in the specific quiet of that corner table, with the walk-in cooler humming the same way it always had, I understood what I'd been circling for 11 years without letting myself land on it, that his carefulness with me had never been the careful distance of a man honoring a contract. It had been the carefulness of someone repaying, in his own quiet way, a debt he'd been raised to believe mattered more than almost anything else, and who had then found himself, somewhere along the way, wanting to stay for reasons that had stopped being about the debt at all, and had never quite found the nerve to say so. I asked him, that night, the question I'd never let myself ask across 14 years of careful distance, whether any part of what had grown between us was real to him, separate from Charles Thorne's old ledger and his father's rule about business and family never trading places. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, and then he said, I think I stopped being able to tell the difference somewhere around year 3. I think that's part of why I kept coming on Thursdays even after there was no real business reason left to discuss. I told him I felt the same way about the corner table. Neither of us called it love that night. We didn't need to. We're still married, 3 years past that conversation, and I won't pretend it turned into some sweeping declaration overnight, because it didn't, and that was never going to be this story. What changed was quieter and steadier than that. We stopped being two careful people honoring an old family debt disguised as a marriage, and became two people who kept choosing the corner table, on purpose, long after either of us needed a reason to. There have been harder stretches since, too, ones I think any honest telling of this has to include. There was a period, about a year after that Thursday conversation, when I found myself unexpectedly resentful, not at Sebastian, exactly, but at the sheer amount of time the two of us had spent circling something real without either of us having the nerve to name it plainly. I said as much to him once, on an ordinary evening with nothing dramatic building toward it, and he didn't try to talk me out of the feeling. He just said, I know. I've done the same math, and let the sentence sit there between us, unresolved, the way we'd both learned to let things sit rather than forcing them toward tidiness they didn't yet have. That photograph still hangs behind the register. I finally told the story behind it, a version of it anyway, to Delphine, who listened without saying much and then told me she'd suspected something like that for years, the way people who've watched two other people carefully for a decade sometimes do. I told my sister, too, eventually, over dinner one Sunday, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said, that sounds like Grandma. She never once let anybody thank her properly for anything. I think that's true. I think it might be the truest thing anyone said about her since she died. I asked Sebastian, once, fairly recently, whether he thought his grandfather had known, when he wrote that letter in 1971, that the debt might eventually circle back in a form as strange as a marriage. He thought about it for a while before answering, the way he thinks about most things, and said he doubted his grandfather had imagined anything so specific, that he suspected Charles had simply wanted the debt written down somewhere, in case it ever mattered to someone, without any real expectation of how or when that might happen. "I think he just didn't want it to disappear," Sebastian said. "Some kindnesses, if nobody writes them down, just evaporate. I think he wanted this one to have a chance of finding its way back, whatever shape that took." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else he's ever said to me. I think about my grandmother sometimes, standing outside that unmarked building in 1962, extending a kindness to a young man nobody else trusted, with no way of knowing it would eventually circle back, decades later, to the granddaughter she never got to meet grown. I don't think she did it expecting anything in return. I think that's rather the point of the whole story, that the truest kindnesses are the ones extended without any accounting of what they might someday earn you, and that sometimes, if you're patient enough, or simply lucky enough, they find their way back to you anyway, in forms you never could have predicted, carried by people who were raised, quietly and carefully, to remember. I want to tell you about one small ritual we've kept since that Thursday conversation, because it feels like the truest ending I can give you. We still sit at that corner table most Thursday evenings, though there are no manifests to review anymore, no pretense of business left to justify it. Sometimes we talk about the restaurant, or his work, or nothing at all. Sometimes we just sit there in the quiet, the way we did for years before either of us understood what the quiet actually meant. I've come to think that's the real shape of what survived out of all of it, not a grand declaration, not a storybook turn, but the simple, stubborn fact that two careful people kept choosing the same table, week after week, long after anyone required it of them. I've thought, too, about how easily this could have gone differently, how many families, handed the same old debt, might simply have let it lapse, the way most debts of kindness eventually do once the people who remember them are gone. The Thorns could have restructured our note and never mentioned Charles Thorn's name at all. Sebastian could have gone along with his mother's arrangement without ever asking to be the one who found our note in the first place. I don't know exactly what made a family raised on the rule that business and feeling should never trade places choose, quietly, to let an old debt of feeling shape a business decision anyway. I suspect it has something to do with the particular kind of man Sebastian turned out to be underneath all that careful reserve, someone who took his grandfather's rule seriously enough to live by it for most of his life, and human enough, in the end, to let one very old exception through. I married a man for money, once, certain I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. I didn't. What I actually married into, without knowing it, was the far end of a debt my own grandmother had planted decades before I was born, tended in silence by a family that believed, the way mine had always believed about food and shelter and second chances, that some things are worth doing quietly, and worth doing without ever expecting to be thanked. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.